Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us once again for our weekly briefing on preventing and managing COVID-19 in the workplace. And Happy New Year. I hope it was all a good long weekend of rest and relaxation as we jump into this next year, high speed, full speed ahead. This is Karen O'Hara. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications for WorkCare and your moderator for each session. Most of you have attended in the past, so you know our routine. We present for about half an hour and save 10 to 15 minutes at the conclusion for questions. Please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for and answer all of them in writing and post it on our website within a couple days on the COVID-19 page. You can find us at www.workcare.com. We also record the session and upload it on our YouTube channel. Our presenter is Anthony Harris, MD, MBA, MPH. Dr. Harris is board certified in occupational medicine. He's WorkCare's Chief Innovation Officer and Associate Medical Director for on-site clinical operations. He's also our lead clinician for our COVID-19 response. So I'll turn it right over to him. Thank you for joining us.
Excellent. Thank you, Karen. And thanks everyone for joining once again. Hopefully everyone can hear me okay. We're trying a little different audio this time. Hopefully it's a little bit more clear. And we'll jump right into it. Welcome to the new year. Happy New Year to everyone. 2021 is upon us, and we are full throttle with efforts to strategize on how to keep our workforce safe as we continue into this COVID pandemic. And today we'll be talking about primarily the vaccine updates. We'll talk a little bit about new metrics that we want to examine in regards to epidemiology, and we'll get into some good pathology here today as well to hopefully communicate to your employees and your workforce the real nature of these mutations that are becoming all the popular sound bits in the media. So without further ado, we'll continue this year with a progression of our format from last year. We all often say, if it ain't broken, don't fix it. And so far, I think it's been really well received in terms of how we've put things together and presented to you. So we'll keep it up. The clinical update will start, followed by the pathology, microbiology, epidemiology, looking at the numbers, macroscopically, globally, as well as US focused. And then we'll get into the prevention and workforce strategies that we recommend here at WorkCare as we are helping our employers across the board. So today's clinical presentation is going to be centered on mortality, right? We want to look at and examine the impact of COVID-19 from this ultimate clinical impact, if you would. And we want to look at specifically how we're faring in the US in regards to mortality in comparison to other nations. And we want to understand, are there any nuances to be expected in regards to impact from COVID-19 and mortality? So let's look at the total confirmed deaths in the US, both in the US as well as globally. If we look at the United States on a 7-day rolling average, we are well above 1,000 deaths a day, right? We're right around 1,500 deaths a day. And if we look at our trend, obviously we are continuing to trend upward from where we were weeks and months ago. If we look at then our neighbors and our other impacted nations, they're not too far behind us, and they're still on a slightly upward trend, some more than others. So we can see that not only are the cases growing, but the deaths in terms of overall is growing as well. So we understand that this is why we need to continue to double down on our efforts to keep people safe. If we look at numbers now from Johns Hopkins in regards to mortality deaths per 100,000, here's how it breaks down nation by nation. Italy at the highest there, looking at mortality 126 per 100,000. We see the UK not too far behind that at 114, US at 109, right? So we know we were and have been high in the pack in terms of the impact from COVID-19 and mortality. And we want to continue to examine this with looking at then what is the observed case fatality rate. And these numbers pan out a little differently as we look at this particular metric. Mexico being top of the heap with 8.8 as the observed case fatality ratio, followed by, if we jump down to United Kingdom to see where they are and their impact, 2.7. We're further down there, 1.7, which is a number that you likely have heard, but we want to confirm and update with you in terms of the case fatality rate from COVID specific to the US. This is how we're faring. This is where we're at in regards to management in the ICU that we talked about weeks before, management with those who are hospitalized, not in the ICU, and we will examine further some risk factors in that regard. So as we look at then a study that came from, this study was published December 17th of last year, and looking at the characteristics, morbidity, mortality of the flu versus COVID, we want to see the differences because we want to understand, are we being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19 in regards to mortality than what we would see with the flu? Because we know there is obviously rumors out there that COVID is still not as bad as the flu, right? And so we want to distill those myths down to its quintessential metrics, and in this case, mortality. So let's examine this study that looked at a French cohort retrospectively between the dates of March 1st through April of last year. And we looked at hospitalized individuals with both flu, influenza, as well as updated here with COVID cases, and examining then the mortality of these cases. 89, almost 90,000 patients were in this study. Half of them, 45,000 of them, almost 46,000 with influenza, hospitalized in France during this study period. If we look at the average age, the median age rather, 68 years for the cohort of COVID patients, 71 years for the cohort of influenza patients. And what we found in this study, and what we see from the conclusions, is that the individuals in the COVID cohort more likely to have diabetes, hypertension, dyslipidemia, which is just high cholesterol essentially, and patients that were in the influenza camp had increased heart failure, chronic respiratory disease, cirrhosis, and some anemia, low blood cell count. And these hospitalized individuals experienced for the COVID individuals, experienced more respiratory failure, more pulmonary embolisms, that means blood clots in the lungs, more septic shock, which is a dramatic drop in the blood pressure that can cause end organ damage, and bleeding, hemorrhagic stroke in the brain, okay? And if we look at the influenza cohort, they suffered more from heart attacks, myocardial infarction, and what's called atrial fibrillation. And that AFib for short is the heart beating abnormally fast. And as we look at then the mortality comparatively between COVID patients and influenza patients, we see a dramatic difference in impact from COVID compared to a risk of death from influenza. And that number is 2.9 relative risk. What does that mean? That means if you had COVID in the hospital during this time period, you are 2.9, you had a 2.9 times greater risk of dying because of COVID than if you were hospitalized for influenza. If we looked at further down on this, adolescents in particular, they had a 10 times more likelihood of dying from COVID than influenza if they were hospitalized because of the illness. So again, our goal here in examining this clinical data is to dispel the myths that are out there around COVID still not being as bad as the flu, and to give an update as to the impact of COVID causing mortality across the board, both in the US and abroad. Now for digging a little deeper into the pathology around some of the things you've been seeing in the media with regard to mutations of the virus. Obviously, there's a significant fear that these mutations coming out of the UK, coming out of South Africa, would cause an increase in mortality, an increase in severity of disease, or perhaps an increase in the transmission rate of the disease itself. So let's dive into some of the particulars behind, from a pathology standpoint, what this looks like in reality versus what's being popularized in the media. So we're going back to the basics, back to that spike protein that we're all familiar with, right? That spike protein being how the virus itself, SARS-CoV-2, enters our cell. It attaches to our ACE2 receptors. And so when we're talking about mutations, as in this new strain coming out of the UK and South Africa, it is germane to that spike protein having mutations. And we will examine this a little bit more deeply here. And if you're ready, we're going to geek out, begin the year geeking out here on some immunology, pathoimmunology, right? And we want to look at then whether or not these spike protein mutations really are a threat to both mortality and really are a threat to both transmission, and why and how, perhaps. So as we look at this schematic here, we want to keep it super simple. We're not going to geek out too much here, but we want to examine certain spots in this representation, the connection of that spike protein to our ACE2 receptors, right? And so we know that the spike protein has various regions that are coded for attaching to our cells, and that's how it gets into our body essentially and is able to replicate, right? And so these numbers, the S477, G485, represent those touch points in which the cells talk to each other, or the genetic material of the virus and our ACE2 receptors and the cells that present those receptors talk to each other, or bind rather. And these binding sites are where the mutation occurs, particularly, again, not just in the case of the UK strain and the South Africa strain, but strains that we've been seeing from day one of this pandemic, almost day one of this pandemic. And so we want to break down what this looks like over time. We've examined this many months ago, briefly during a presentation, and we're getting back to that so that we can understand the lineage, or phylogeny rather, for SARS-CoV-2. Phylogeny meaning the study of genetic drift and genetic shift of viruses. And in this case, we're looking specifically at the beginning, way back in December of 2019, the emergence of SARS-CoV-2, right? And that 19A that you see represented down towards the bottom left represents one of the earliest lineages of SARS-CoV-2. Each branch point that you're seeing here then represents a different mutation, a different variant. Some call it a different a different line of disease, if you would. But these all refer to how this virus has changed and morphed over time. And so the first thing I want to point out and emphasize is that, yes, the UK and the South African variants are new, newly identified, but in their inception, in terms of how they were created, there's nothing new in that process there. This process has been occurring since the beginning of the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic. So as we look at this in a different depiction, right, we want to talk about this in terminology called a clade. Now, a clade is nothing more than just a different branch point in this phylogeny, or the development in the mutation history of the virus itself. So the depiction you see here with the different colors represent a different clade over time. So we can see the proportionality to which clade G versus clade S versus clade V in this particular nomenclature has played out from a cumulative standpoint and propagated throughout not just the East and the West, but across the world, right? And we look at then a different representation branch point wise on the right-hand side of this graphic, looking at, again, these different clades. Again, the nomenclature here is similar to what we just mentioned, the V1 versus the S1, the G3 clades. These are all, again, representative of different genetic mutations that have occurred and caused new strains of the virus to propagate amongst the general public. If we break it down a little bit further, we're going to talk about, and this is really geeking out here around genetics. We won't go too deep in terms of causing a poor translation of what this information means to your workforce. But we'll simplify it in this way. If you see these little circles here, we're circling these we're circling these letters, C, A, T, G, representative of actual genetic points in the genetic profile of SARS-CoV-2. So this is classic genetics, right? And what happens when we have a new strain form is that these letters change, all right? And these letters are representative of our building blocks, our DNA, cytosine, adenine, thymine, guanine, all right? And these actual genetic nucleic acids change. They're called point mutations. And these point mutations give rise to new strains of the virus, right? And so if we look downward here at point D in this depiction, we're seeing different nomenclatures for different clades. Again, the clades represent the different genetic makeup of a common ancestor, right? Over time, mutations of this SARS-CoV-2 has happened, and this is how we represent those different families or clades moving forward. So what does all this mean, right? How does this relate back to what we're seeing play out with the new strain? So the UK variant, it's titled VUI 2020-12/01, was first discovered last year. The data that has come from this discovery was representative of about 25,000 samples out of the UK, 6% of those samples having this mutation. And this mutation is a amalgam of several mutations that have occurred. Deletions, they're called. So these deletions in particular has given rise to this new lineage, causing that spike protein specifically to bind a little different with antibodies that are floating around in our system if we've already recovered from COVID-19, or antibodies that develops from a acquired immunity such as vaccination, right? And so at the end of the day, is this impact because of the location in the spike protein significant? So let's get a little deeper into the South African variants. Again, we're seeing variants in these particular clades, the GH, the GR, the G clades, and these mutations we've seen before. And these mutations that have the interface at that spike protein and our H2 receptor, fortunately, is not impactful to overall, so far, the data shows that it's not impactful to overall impact of mortality and or severity of the illness. We'll touch back on this shortly, but we wanted to emphasize the pathology behind these new strains. So again, we can simplify this to our workforce and allay their concerns that these new strains are going to cause new disease or cause new severity in the populations that are impacted by COVID-19. So let's start to look at the epidemiology as it stands today in this 2021 new year here. And we're looking at then where we were several weeks ago, 2 weeks ago in the US with total number of cases at 19 million. Last week with the total number of deaths at that 0.7 per 100,000 on a 7-day rolling average. And where we stand today, if we look at then the 20 million cases, almost 21 million cases, that's 64.5 out of 100,000 in the US over the 7-day rolling average, and 0.8 being that the deaths per 100,000 now at that 20 million impact number. We know we're still getting hit hard. We're after the holidays, we're seeing numbers go up. Here's what it's looking like from a comparison of the US and our neighbors in the UK, Brazil, Italy, etc. Right? We're still leading the pack on a 7-day rolling average, and we want to understand: are we going to see this plateau over the next week or two? Unlikely, right? Because of the holiday and the transmissions that have occurred as a result of the holidays. Again, anecdotally, we're seeing these numbers spike with the clients that we're assisting with encounters and exposures as well as transmissions. If we look at then the share of the tests that are positive, representing how we're articulating the burden of illness in the US, we want to now compare this to several other nations that are highly impacted by COVID-19. Mexico being at the top of the heap now in regards to positivity rate for these tests that are conducted, meaning that burden of illness in Mexico is likely far more dramatic than what is being communicated at this point in time. Now, if we look down further, we can see, the South Africa, Colombia, and then finally United States here down in that position where we're still trending upward, right? And we want to make sure that this trend reverses and trends downward, so that we feel more confident that we're articulating the burden of illness in the US accurately here. If we look at then total cases, total tests, we want to look at then where we are in the U.S. versus how we compare to the United Kingdom and other nations. We're seeing a downward trend, which we've seen week over week now. Now down to that million. Hopefully, don't get under the million mark, but down to that million of tests conducted daily. We'll continue to dive into this number. We haven't found any data as to the causality yet of why the number of tests haven't increased over time, but we're seeing data that has spanned from September of last year, suggesting that it's a manufacturing issue in regards to being able to produce enough tests to utilize in the U.S. in a more voluminous way than what we're seeing today. In terms of the case fatality rate of the pandemic, we want to re-examine this compared to other nations, looking at a different body of data. Again, we see that Mexico is being impacted most dramatically, and we see the U.S. down relative to what we saw earlier with the Hopkins data articulated in a different graphic. So we'll continue to examine both the epidemiology in this way. We'll start to look at the epidemiology as it stands from tracking the virus, as tracking the vaccines as well. So jumping into the prevention and tracking with vaccines, we'll continue to be really from this point forward as we have more vaccinations occurring in the U.S. And across the world, more deeper numbers on tracking vaccines. So when we talk about what's new and the impact of these emergent cases or clades, if you would, of the vaccine, of the virus, is it going to impact the vaccines? And there's some pundits out there that suggest, yeah, it could actually affect the antibodies once they're formed in the body against a different strain of COVID-19. So let's examine that a little bit more. Let's examine that further as we look at specifically the data on these mutations and its impact to that binding site on the ACE2 receptor. Again, as we have seen in this particular UK variant, there's no evidence yet that there is an impact from a dramatic mortality as well as severity of disease from this mutation. And obviously, more data is necessary to fully understand the impact of these mutations. But again, nothing emergent at this point in time to suggest there's going to be a dramatic shift in impact of COVID as a result of this variant. Same goes for the South African variant. So let's look at the updated vaccines that have been approved thus far. We can see obviously Pfizer, Moderna are there. The Sinovac vaccine that is in China, as well as the Wuhan vaccine has been utilized. Well over 1 million individuals in China vaccinated early on in the fall of last year. The clinical data is still pending there. And then we see the Russian vaccine, another Chinese vaccine, as well as the peptide vaccine out of Russia, all approved at this point in time. So 10 vaccines or 7 vaccines approved at this time. And we're adding to that just this week an approval in Mexico of the AstraZeneca vaccine for emergency utilization, right? And so we'll see how this, in terms of side effects, as well as number of vaccines distributed and administered, goes in regards to its acceptance here and approval in Mexico. Is the short list. This is the short list of the vaccines still in phase 3 clinical trials. I want to point out here several vaccines that we're looking forward to in regards to an advance of where we are today. Johnson & Johnson being one of them, looking at a single-dose vaccine. They also are in a phase 3 clinical trial for a 2-dose vaccine, but is perhaps the leader right now in the hopes of having a single-dose vaccine, meaning you don't have to go back and get revaccinated to reach a acceptable level of effectiveness for protection against COVID-2 or SARS-CoV-2 because you have neutralizing antibodies after 1 dose. All right. We see a couple of the ones that we talked about, the Novavax using nanoparticles. All these clinical trials are still moving forward. We haven't seen any evidence of any halts that haven't restarted yet, but we'll continue to update as we move forward here. So some of the things we want to talk about in regards to other additional updates with AstraZeneca and some other vaccines out of the UK. Obviously, the Pfizer vaccine and the AstraZeneca doses proposed by the UK, they're moving forward with, in a fashion where they're going to give one dose, right, that first dose, to as many people as they can. And they're going to delay that second dose so that the number of people immunized is far greater, double the number, if you would, for protection against COVID-19. So how is that going to pan out, right? Essentially, that AstraZeneca vaccine, that's 70% effective after 2 doses, and Pfizer, that's 95% effective after 2 doses, changes, right? That efficacy goes down for the first dose. If we look at Pfizer, it's down at 80%, and obviously lower than that for AstraZeneca, with that full dose being only 70%. So the strategy there, is it likely to be adopted by the US? If you look at what Anthony Fauci has said, the answer to that is probably not likely, right? And so it won't be until FDA puts forth guidance, most likely, that they approve or support a one-dose strategy, that we're going to see any substantial change from a state-to-state determination. Again, meaning states have the right to make a determination on how the vaccine is distributed in their geographic. If they are so inclined, the leadership there, to do a one-dose strategy, technically, could they? Yes, right? But again, we're not likely to see that until we have some type of FDA stance on a one-dose strategy to increase the number of people vaccinated versus fewer people vaccinated with 2 doses. So now let's look at, as we're going to track on a week-to-week basis, the total distribution of vaccines in the US. And this graphic is representative of that. So we can see the states that have received 1 million or more distributed doses in the US. Again, these are distributed doses, not administered doses, right? And so we can see where these concentrations are, and we'll see how this changes over time. If we look at now then the individuals who have initiated the vaccination, then we can see, and we drop that number down to the hundreds of thousands, right? Where those states that have received initiations of more than 100,000, more than 200,000 are in that dark blue zones, all right? And we'll track this, because the biggest issue right now facing the U.S. is not one of distribution or distribution of vaccine. It's the logistics of administering the vaccine and without creating a lot of waste, right? And so if we take a step back, look at total number distributed, we're at 17 million distributed doses of vaccines. And this is inclusive of both Pfizer and Moderna, right? And if we look at the number of people initiating vaccines, we're just under 5 million. So that's a stark difference, right? And you've likely seen the reports in the media around the time scale necessary to get to that herd immunity. We've talked about it before, 196 million Americans vaccinated and or having natural immunity to reach that herd immunity number. And at this rate, we're going to be well into 2022 before we get there, perhaps, right? So there needs to be some dramatic changes, both not just in distribution, but also logistics and administration of vaccines as we move forward. So now, what do we do with all this data, this information? Do we change our strategy? What strategies do we need to have in place, not just for continuing to weather the storm today, but to continue to do a good job of helping our workers stay safe and come back to work safely moving forward? And so we want to look at then requirements for vaccinations and do an update of this. I'm not a lawyer, obviously, but we want to opine about what we believe is, one, clinically prudent, as well as feasible for our employers from a med legal standpoint. And we know that, as we've spoken about before, there are a couple areas that we need to touch on in order to fully understand the ramifications of these required vaccines. The first one being just the flat out business necessity, right? As we have seen in healthcare, travel, and other retailers in which you have close proximity continuously of the employees as well as the general public, those are strong cases for requiring vaccinations. And that is well supported, not just in historic trends around requirements, but obviously you're seeing this today happen in the frontline workers in healthcare. The basis for employment is you need to be vaccinated. The same thing is playing out in the travel industry, in which travel passports are even being contemplated and developed, so we can require vaccinations for travel. And we'll touch on that more so next week as well. If we look at then the second touch point here, liability for not requiring the vaccination is something that may play out moving forward. Because employers have a general duty clause to protect their workforce, it is contemplated that in an environment in which employees are not required to be vaccinated, there may be lawsuits filed against the employer for failure to protect the workforce adequately. So this is something to contemplate, again, because we're going to see states divide very, very likely on this topic, as this will be a fragmented state by state determination with regard to OSHA and how it plays out with EEOC as well. And so we want to make sure that, again, we have these considerations in the forefront of our conversations in our workforce, amongst our workforce leadership, so that we're making the right call when it's appropriate. Current guidance around, again, mandating the vaccinations in the workplace, as well as when we talk about EEOC and CDC, both support in terms of evidence being able to make this requirement, okay? And so we haven't seen any written statement yet published by EEOC in this regard. However, again, the litmus test has been the definition of what constitutes a direct threat to the workforce. And this we do have evidence of, this we do have support directly from CDC and EEOC. Therefore, as employers have done in the past, they can rely on this definition to move forward with a strategy of requiring vaccinations in the workplace. So when we talk about then the next hurdle, let's say that we are going to take a strategy of required vaccinations or a strategy of voluntary vaccinations. How do we help our employers track those vaccines and track those vaccinations that occur in the workforce? And this is what we want you thinking about, right? There are a couple factors that need to happen in order to validate who's been vaccinated. The first one is clinical validation, right? Is an individual compliant with their vaccine protocol? If they received a 2-dose vaccine, we need to have documentation of that, and that needs to be a part of a clinical history. And that obviously would require collaboration with your providers, whether it's a fragmented state by state, or hopefully whether it's a concerted, consolidated effort to track across multiple states who has been vaccinated and who has not. Realize that the solution states are coming up with in regards to tracking individuals who have been vaccinated is a state by state database, right? We have not yet seen a national database that tracks individuals receiving the vaccine. Therefore, instead of having to go piecemeal state by state as an employer with multiple state locations, it's more prudent and more simplified to rely on your provider to assist with clinically validating who has been vaccinated and received their second dose if necessary versus just the first dose. The second piece to this is, again, that multi-state tracking, and in addition to that, the type of vaccine that's received. Why is that important? Because as we know, if we receive the Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, efficacy is up to 95% after 2 doses. AstraZeneca, only 70%. And capturing that information, holding it so that we can make determination on who is safe to come back and when may be prudent for us as we move forward and understand the level of transmissions that still may occur after vaccinations in individuals with particular vaccines. So again, strong collaboration use case here between clinician and the workforce management. And then the last one to consider is reasonable accommodations. We know that there is a requirement when we're talking about a strategy of either voluntary or mandatory vaccinations in the workplace to provide reasonable accommodations. And so how you document these reasonable accommodations, how you determine what is reasonable and what is not, obviously the burden is on the employer. However, collaboration with your clinician is going to give you deeper insight, allow us to capture more information around not just religious exemptions, but clinical exemptions as to why an individual may not be applicable for a vaccine at this point in time. And so if this strategy is not at the forefront of discussion at this point in time in your workforce management and leadership, let us have a conversation with you so that we can start to point out those bullet points that are going to play out over the next couple of months at each of these levels. And then as we move forward week to week here, we're going to double down on understanding the mechanics of these strategies, as well as points of access for both the vaccine and tracking the vaccine throughout the workforce. So with that, we will stop our first presentation of the year, and we will open it up to questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. I learned a new word, clade. I didn't know about it. Geeking out is always beneficial.
Awesome.
I have a question regarding the value of testing, which we promised we would discuss also today. And my question is, you've characterized the burden of illness in terms of mortality. What impact do you think a broader testing strategy would have on reducing that burden?
Sure, it's all about prevention. The increased tests, the better we articulate the burden of illness in regards to number of people who are affected by COVID, who contract COVID, the better we can do with contact tracing, the better we can do with prevention of transmission and reducing that reproductive rate, that R naught number. And just to update on that number, again, it average-wise across the U.S. is in between 1.2 and 1.5, but in some locations as high as 4 and 5, meaning 5 people are infected by one person with COVID. So the articulation of burden of illness from a testing strategy gives us a better opportunity to prevent transmissions, and that's what it's all about at the end of the day.
Is there a methodology for tracking testing and vaccinations, like an automated system in place to enable that for employers?
So actually at WorkCare, we are developing a digital platform for, at this point, tracking both. We have a digital platform and we've launched it and been using it for tracking testing, right? Whether it's PCR, saliva, whether it's rapid antigen testing, etc. And then we also have developed and will be launching a vaccine tracker to assist, again, our employers across the board, multi-states, on who's been vaccinated, and then can make a determination clinically on who's safe and when they're safe to come back to the workforce.
Okay, next question. Thank you for those answers. Does COVID infection cause hair shedding in some people who have recovered? If so, is the hair loss likely to reverse over time?
That's a great question that I have not seen any evidence of as of yet in regards to a side effect of COVID-19, loss of hair, alopecia, otherwise. It's something we can look into specifically to see if there's any literature out there to support that impact from a clinical standpoint. But as of yet, I have not seen any, and I'm not aware of any evidence that would suggest COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 causes hair loss in a substantial way.
Are you aware of any of the vaccines causing infertility?
No, at this point in time, we know that SARS-CoV-2 can cause some, not necessarily fertility issues, but erectile dysfunction in men as a result of the impact to the microvasculature in the penis, right? As well as a couple other factors from the impact from COVID-19. But a direct impact to fertility is something that would be associated with impact to the testes, and there's some evidence to suggest that there is an impact to men in fertility, but that research is still ongoing. So I haven't seen anything conclusively saying there's a fertility impact, but again, that body of data exists that is examining the true impact there.
Okay, next question. With tested, effective, and EUA-approved treatments, such as remdesivir, Regeneron, and monoclonal antibodies, etc., on the shelf and widely in the system, why do you think we're still seeing the same degree of deaths and bad outcomes?
It would likely, now this is Dr. Harris opining as to the causality there, right? Do we have any body of data that links the mortality with supply and demand or distribution of these interventions? No, right? However, is likely as it exists, unfortunately, in healthcare across the board, a logistic and distribution issue in regards to adequate utilization and appropriate clinical utilization of these interventions across the board. So as we've experienced decades long, access to healthcare in the U.S. is not equitable. And because of that disequity, we can experience and we can still see a dramatic difference in which states, which geographics experience which level of impact from SARS-CoV-2. The other aspect of it is the clinical support from access to ICU beds, hospital beds in general. So.
Okay, this is an interesting question about having a dual vaccination. I'll read you the question. Assuming that J&J's vaccine receives emergency use authorization, do you anticipate any benefit to a person receiving this adenovirus with DNA embedded format after previously receiving an mRNA format from the Pfizer, Moderna, AstraZeneca vaccine?
So I am not aware of any studies that have examined the impact from an efficacy standpoint of a dual vaccine combination. However, from a scientific or clinical standpoint, there would likely not be much benefit in regards to how your body manufactures antibodies against the spike protein itself. Because both methodologies, whether it's mRNA providing the building blocks for the spike protein to be presented and offer immunocompetence in that pathway versus the spike protein being introduced in the adenovirus amplification pathway, both lead to the same inevitability of antibody recognition of the spike protein. Having a dual vaccine process likely will not make either way more efficacious above and beyond their baseline efficaciousness. Now, with that being said, obviously, AstraZeneca being only 70% efficacious and you introduce a vaccine that is 95% efficacious in terms of Pfizer, yes, you will likely have the higher level of efficaciousness from the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine.
Here's a couple questions related to return to work planning. They're both regarding quarantine protocols. What quarantine protocols should be followed by someone who has already had and recovered from COVID and who subsequently has close contact with an infected person?
Sure. So pretty straightforward across the board. What we're seeing is if you have recovered from COVID-19, and we confirm that clinically, right, and you have a exposure subsequently within 90 days after your recovery, you're likely in the clear. Your body has developed an immune response sufficient to prevent you from contracting again and transmitting COVID-19 in that time period. Beyond that, it still would be recommended to do a quarantine outside of that window because we have seen transmissions after recovering from COVID-19 outside that window. Again, albeit not a tremendous onslaught of reinfections. However, we know that after that 90-day window, your immune system capability to respond to COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 begin to diminish. And so we at this point in time, move forward with that recommendation.
Similarly, the person wants to know if the person has been vaccinated and then subsequently has close contact with an infected person, what quarantine protocol do you recommend?
So there has not been any published statements from CDC or FDA in regards to a limitation on or being able to avoid quarantine after vaccination within a time period. However, from a clinical standpoint, it would still follow that an individual, much like who has recovered from COVID-19, who has been vaccinated, will not have a high likelihood of contracting or transmitting COVID-19 within that 90-day window for sure, and up to 180 days based upon studies that are even longer, up to 8 months, and studies that have examined how long individuals may have immunity as a result of vaccination.
Okay, well, we're out of time. We have a couple of remaining questions. One of it is regarding some issues with Cal Osha. So Joel will address those with you individually, and then another person was asking about our testing services, and we'll also reply to that individually. And we'll be posting answers to all questions on our website as always. If there's any topics you want us to address in the coming weeks, please send them our way. We appreciate your participation from week to week, and feel free to invite any of your colleagues who might be missing out. We always are happy to have additional attendees every week. Thanks again, Dr. Harris. Happy New Year to everyone.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you same time, same place next week. Take care. God bless.